Earlier this year, I made a bold and controversial statement that immediately resulted in the screeching of fanboys everywhere when I made the statement that I felt that Final Fantasy VII had become somewhat overrated. This was how I opened my review of Rebirth, though many obviously didn't listen to what I said moments later when I admitted that, although I felt that FF7 was becoming a victim of its own hype and reputation, it was hard to argue against those die-hard fans when the original was as good as it was, and when Rebirth helped to flesh out those characters even more and make them even more endearing. Now, those of you who have any listening comprehension at all may understand me to be saying that even though I think it gets more praise than it probably deserves, it's by no means a bad entry in the series, and if you listened to my review, you'll know that I loved Rebirth overall, complaints about excessive minigames aside.
I'm gonna fucking shoot up a Walmart!
Having said all that, if Final Fantasy VII is overrated, it is overrated in an inversely proportional measure to a series that I don't believe gets nearly the praise it deserves over here in the West, and that is the Ys series of games. That's right, I said Ys, not Ys. In Japanese, it's written as Ys, hence the pronunciation Ys. Incidentally, the very first Ys game came out in 1987, the same year as Final Fantasy. However, instead of a traditional turn-based RPG, Ys used an innovative collision or bump system where players collided with enemies. As long as the player did not collide directly, but off-center or diagonally, they could usually avoid damage. This also allowed for a very fast-paced battle system, which also included some bullet hell elements to it. The second game was a direct sequel to the first game, taking place mere moments after the end of the first game. Since then, there have been several games in the series, including Ys Origin, which serves as a prequel to the game, and most recently, Ys X Nordics. Except for Origin, each game follows the adventures of red-headed swordsman Adol Christin as he travels around a fictionalized version of our world, primarily Europe and Africa. Now, it may seem intimidating to new players to know that there are 10 mainline entries in the series, all following the same main protagonist, but worry not, dear gamer. Though the main character, and one supporting character, remains the same throughout the series, you can play them in any order and it really doesn't matter. Now, that's not to say you won't benefit from playing other games because you'll pick up on references to other titles and adventures, but you won't run into the issue of not understanding each game on their own if you don't. However, should you decide to play them all, I will always recommend playing them in release order and not chronological order. The main reason is that the battle systems change so drastically over time that you may find it jarring to go from the newer entries to the older ones, though if you've been playing video games for as many years as I have, you may not care and may actually enjoy the old school feel of earlier titles. For those who don't feel like looking all of this up, the actual chronology of the mainline series, excluding Origin for obvious reasons since it's a prequel and has a completely different cast, goes as follows. Ys Books 1 and 2, known as Ys 1 Ancient Ys Vanished and Ys 2 Ancient Ys Vanished the Final Chapter, was condensed into one game, Ys 1 and 2, on the PC Engine and on TurboGrafx CD. You can probably emulate those versions, or you can snag a copy of the Windows port, which was also the basis for Ys 1 and 2 Chronicles on PSP, which is the version I have because I still have my original PSP. Otherwise, the Windows port is solid. Next in the timeline is Ys X, the subject of this review, and takes place shortly after the events of Ys 1 and 2. Ys 4 is an odd one. There were actually two versions released of this game, Ys 4 Mask of the Sun and Ys 4 Dawn of Ys. Neither of these were directly made by Falcom, the first being made by Tonkin House for the Super Famicom, and the other by Hudson Soft for the PC Engine. Both are fun games in their own right, and I'd recommend them for anyone who wants to see how they differ from one another. However, neither is canon because they were supplanted by Ys Memories of Celceta on the PS Vita, which has since been ported to PS4. Good game, though the ending is a major letdown to most fans of the series since it ends rather abruptly. If you play either the Super Famicom or PC Engine version, you'll see how certain ideas were taken from those and incorporated into the official version of this game. Next comes Ys, The Oath in Felghana. Oath is actually a remake of the original title Ys 3, Wanderers from Ys, which came out on the PC 8801 and PC 9801 before being ported to the MSX2 and X68000. It was then ported to various other consoles, such as the Super NES in 1991. Incidentally, the Super NES version was the first one I ever saw. It was actually on display at Circuit City, This lets you know how old I was at the time, since Circuit City existed, and it was, I came to find out, the last boss fight. There may have been some sort of demo mode or video running because I also got to see the intro cinematic, and for a 6-year-old, this was amazing stuff. Unfortunately, I had no idea what this game was, and it wasn't until I was in college that I stumbled across a screen capture of the fight against the final boss, and finally discovered what the game was. This version deviates from the collision combat of the first 4 games, excluding Salsetta, which wasn't made until years later, and shifts to a side-scroller game. Think of it like a better version of The Adventure of Link, but with a much higher difficulty that stomps you in the balls repeatedly, and not in the fetishistic manner some of you people enjoy. Oath and Felghana remakes this from the ground up into a top-down action RPG, expands the lore, and really elevates this title from somewhat middling to... Well, compared to other games in the series, it's still average, but even an average Ys game is usually a blast to play regardless. And for me, Ys 3 is my entry point into the series, and because of that, it will always have a special place in my heart, even if other games may have better stories. Incidentally, this is being remastered and re-released next year, so if you don't have the Windows port of Felghana or the PSP version, I highly recommend grabbing it when it comes out. Next we have Ys 5, Kefin, The Lost Kingdom of Sand. This one is the only Ys game to never receive a Western release or remake. There is a translation patch for the Super Famicom version out there, which is really the only way most people will ever play this. It's not a terrible game, but it's just sort of meh. Combat's fun, but the magic system is just about completely useless. There's a PS2 remake in Japan, but it too never came over here. There are references to this game in other titles, but unfortunately we don't have an official English release. Honestly, rather than continuing the franchise any further, I really hope Falcom takes the time to give this game the Salsetta treatment and give it a proper remake and release to help it fit in better with the rest of the franchise, since there are a couple of things plot-wise that don't quite mesh perfectly anymore, but keep in mind that these were always released as standalone titles, and future titles always worked around existing lore to make them fit in wherever they were placed. Following his adventures in Kefin, we continue with Ys 8, Lacrimosa of Dana, which is probably where a lot of people came into the series several years ago. Ys 8 continued from where 7 left off, and shifting the combat system to having multiple characters you could switch between, and each character having its own damage type, which could be used to exploit weaknesses of certain enemies and bosses. Lacrimosa of Dana is regarded by many as easily one of the best games in the franchise and an amazing hack-and-slash RPG in its own right. Exploration, soundtrack, and characters are all absolute chef's kiss. Off the top of my head, I really can't remember anything about the game I disliked, and it should absolutely without question be experienced by anyone curious to see what the best of the series has to offer. Adol then goes on to have his adventure in Ys 6, Ark of Nipishtim. This is the game system that would become the basis for the Ys 3 remake, and was the first game released after a decade following Ys 5. I only played through Ark once, so I don't recall too much about it, other than it being a really solid entry in the series and having some good lore connections to other titles. This is another game that is highly regarded among fans of the series and worth checking out. There's a Windows port of this too, which is a great version of the game. Following Ark of Nipishtim, we have Ys 7, not written as a Roman numeral for once, which takes place following the events of Ys 6. 7 takes place on the same continent, Afroka, you can get it, as Ys 5, with Ys 8 and 6 serving as intermediate journeys on the way to this location. As mentioned earlier, this was another major change for the series following the revamp of 6, and introduced the combat system that has been generally used through today with some variation. Lastly, we have Ys 9, Monstrum Nox. This is the latest game chronologically that was released, and one that I felt was actually a step backwards following Ys 8. And that's not to say the game is bad, I just felt that the pacing was a bit slow, the exploration was a bit lackluster considering the fact that you're confined to a castle city for a good chunk of the game, and there were also some problems with pre-rendered scenes playing in certain sections that were clearly a lower resolution than the real-time rendered scenes. Again, it's not a bad game, and once the plot gets going and the big reveals begin, I actually enjoy the story a lot more. I also think some of it may be having such a high bar set from the previous title, and my expectations being incredibly high. Still, it's still Ys, and it's still fun overall, but it's not without its warts. Now, having given you all the crash course in Ys history that nobody asked for.
This might be hard to believe, but are you aware that nobody gives a shit
How do I feel about the latest game to come out, Ys X Nordics? Is it a worthy entry in the Ys franchise, or is this a case where the publishers have begun losing their way with a beloved series? Well, I will say this. It was refreshing for me to play a game where for the first time in a while I don't have to worry about either side of the political aisle trying to shove their bad takes onto a game or manufacture controversy where there really isn't one. I got to sit down with a game and, believe it or not, just get to have fun for fun's sake.
No, unacceptable.
That's not to say I didn't have fun with games like Stellar Blade and Silent Hill 2 Remake, but just about nobody I know plays this series, except for Johnny over on Happy Console Gamer, but he's an outlier who actually imported the Japanese release just so he could play it even if he couldn't read Japanese. Speaking of which, if you aren't following his channel, you really should. He's a breath of fresh air. And has a very impressive collection of games he's built up over the years, and you can tell he truly loves gaming as a hobby. Playing video games can still be fun, especially when you don't have someone in your ear constantly telling you every game that comes out is total trash.
Endless trash!
Anyway, I digress. The point is that Ys X was incredibly fun for me, minus a few gripes here and there, but those are easily overlooked by how good everything else was. So, as I said earlier, Ys X takes place following the events of Ys 1 and 2, with Adol and his best bro Dogi sailing on the ocean when they and another of their companions, Dr. Flare, also present in Ys 1 and 2 and Memories of Celceta, are attacked by the Norman fleet, this world's version of Norse Vikings. After being detoured to the town of Karnak, Adol comes across a talking seashell that grants him the power of mana, and shortly thereafter is magically tethered to the Norse princess herself, Karja, the one responsible for leading the aforementioned raid. It also just so happens that mana is the only power that is able to defeat a species of monsters called Grieger, who are immortal unless killed with the power of mana. Before you know it, the town is being raided by Grieger, the citizens of Karnak are captured, and Adol and Karja are relocated to the Nordic village of Balto, whereupon they are ultimately sent out to discover the source of the uptick in Grieger activity and put a stop to it once and for all, rescuing the citizens of Karnak when convenient. I say convenient, but that's literally a plot point Karja points out. She and the Nordics aren't going to go out of their way to help Karnak if it distracts from putting down a greater threat. That's the backdrop for the game, and there are your typical Ys shenanigans with little bits of mystery strewn throughout the story to keep you invested.
No, my lips are sealed. Giving you all the answers would spoil the plot.
Ultimately with a big payoff and an epic final boss, which I have to say is actually a really fun fight. I'm not sure if I'd say it's as epic and impressive as some other final bosses in the series, but from a narrative perspective, I'd say it's pretty satisfying. And for a final boss, it's probably the most normal-looking boss in the series, except for maybe Dark Fact from the original. The last few have had some very otherworldly designs. I was just surprised it didn't turn into that sort of thing at the end. When I was done, I was just sort of sitting there like, oh, I guess that really was their final form after all. Interesting. Again, for anyone who hasn't played any of the rest of the series, that's going to sound really odd and anticlimactic, but a lot of other bosses have turned into, like, gigantic demons, or the source of all life itself, or even some guy controlling the Akashic records. But not here. I'm avoiding showing footage of that fight because I don't want to ruin the ending, so just take my word for it. It's a great fight. I was just surprised how grounded, for lack of a better term, it was. As far as story goes, I enjoyed this a lot better than I did Ys 9, which I felt was a major step backwards from 8 in terms of pacing and storytelling. I'm not sure if I'd put it on equal footing with 8 or not. It's right there next to it, in my opinion. A lot of the side characters are just window dressing in some scenes, though if you do all the side quests, you'll learn more about them as you go, some more than others. Falcom probably could have pared back on a few of them, and it really wouldn't affect the story at all. Each character has a max affinity ranking, which you get from completing all of their side quests, giving gifts to a select few, and then having a final conversation. It's nice for world building, I guess, and none of their stories were dreadful. I'm just not sure it was necessary. Still, that's sort of been par for the course since Ys 8, so if you enjoyed that aspect of things in Ys 8 and 9, you'll be right at home here, since it's more of the same sort of thing. As for the main cast, I liked Donna in 8, but Karja has really grown on me, and I think she's really well done as a character, and she's voiced by Makoto from Persona 5. So if you romance Makoto in P5 or P5 Royal, your favorite waifu is back in a different form here. Now, moving on from the story, let's segue into the combat system, because this is where there has been some debate within the Ys community. Is the battle system in this game garbage, or is it actually really good? The answer is a resounding yes. It's definitely one of those. Now let me explain for those of you who have never played the more recent games in the series. Well, beginning in Ys 7, you have the Flash Guard system, which then evolved into Flash Guard and Flash Dodge in 8, which was reused again the same way in Ys 9, if memory serves correctly. There were a lot of people who loved the introduction of that mechanic, since if you did them correctly, you either slowed down time and got to throw in a lot more attacks very quickly in the case of Flash Dodge, or if you use Flash Guard, you could then be guaranteed a succession of critical hits. I have seen some criticism of this, saying that on higher difficulties it's basically essential to have these mastered, or else you're not going to do any significant damage to bosses, and they just turn into a slog more than anything. The Get Good crowd and the masochists who feel the only real way to play any Ys game is on the hardest difficulty from scratch and get curb stomped repeatedly until you get good, love this sort of thing. Those like myself who aren't as sweaty anymore these days find that sort of thing unappealing, and so we just go and farm stat elixirs to make our stats absolutely ungodly, so we still one-shot everything in existence, even on Inferno, which I thought was hilarious. Remember folks, there's no kill like overkill. That said, Ys takes the battle formula from the previous 3 entries, where you have multiple characters and different weapon types, and simplifies it just a bit more. For plot reasons, instead of 3 characters, you only need to worry about Adol and Karja. Each has their own set of skills, which you can level by using said skill over and over again until they max out, which will either immediately unlock a stronger version of the skill, which you'll need to master to either unlock the next tier of that skill, or serve as a prerequisite for another skill once you level up a bit more. There's also the introduction of the mana line system, which allows you to slot different types of orbs into different places on your skill tree. The more connections you have of a certain color, the stronger the unlocked abilities for the correlating colors are. Most of the orbs are simply red, yellow, and blue, but there are rare materials you can grind for that allow you to create rainbow orbs, which give abilities for all 3 of the primary colors. Later, you'll be able to get dark orbs, which have a Kiss Curse feature, either upping strength significantly at the cost of some defensive stats, or increases your break ability at the expense of your vitality. Personally, even with some of the bonuses you get for inflicting status ailments by getting to a certain number of connections with dark orbs, I didn't think it was worth sacrificing your normal nodes for them. In fact, doing endgame farming, filling both character trees with level 2 and level 3 rainbow orbs far outweighed any benefit I may have seen with dark ones, though I may play around with it a bit more. Oh, and there are skills you unlock while going through the lines. The other change, getting back to what I said about the Flash Guard / Dodge system, is that what we've gotten used to up to this point has been completely revamped, to the praise of some and the chagrin of others. Players have the option to either have Adol and Karja attack in tandem with one another by holding down R2 and pressing X, which will build both characters' SP gauges at the same time, while also granting access to duo attacks. Assuming both characters have just the base level SP maximum of 100 SP for their respective gauges, a duo attack costing 100 SP can be used twice, since as long as there's enough SP total between the 2 characters to carry out the attack, it works. Ultimately, you can increase both gauges to 200 apiece, which means a cumulative total of 400 SP available. Dodging and dashing is still available when controlling characters individually, but it's been simplified quite a bit. Certain attacks are telegraphed by either red or blue auras. If it's blue, you can dodge out of the way, and assuming you dodge correctly, you can issue a counter-strike to deal extra damage. The issue is that this is far easier to do than ever before, and in many cases you can just run around and the game sort of auto-dodges for you, or at least counts it as a dodge simply because you're holding down the run/dodge button. You still have to be moving, but still. As for blocking, you can still do a perfect block, which allows you to parry an enemy's attack, but if I'm saying things correctly, there's no guaranteed crit afterwards like there was in earlier titles. And for that matter, holding down the duo guard button allows you to basically just block everything while taking little to no damage. Now that's not to say there aren't things that this doesn't work for. Using Duo Guard against a blue aura attack, for example, won't allow you to avoid incoming damage from that, and there are certain abilities that will straight up break your guard, so you do have to look out for that. Perfect dodging or perfect blocking as a duo can grant you a duo counter-strike that does some major damage, but for most mobs you can just block the whole time and guard each other with no drawbacks. Now, from a narrative perspective, it actually makes sense to encourage players to have Adol and Karja guard each other a lot. That actually ties directly into their relationship with one another. Against certain bosses, knowing when to guard at the right time is imperative, but you can't rely on it all the time since certain bosses can break your guard outright or they use a lot of attacks you need to dodge. The last boss does this a lot, so relying simply on guarding the whole time won't actually do you any good. You still need to know how to fight properly. Still, narrative reasons aside, I'm torn on this myself. Don't get me wrong, I don't want them to have you rely on flash guard / dodge so much that the game basically just turns into another FromSoft title with anime aesthetics, but there was something satisfying about how the guard / dodge mechanic worked before this. Let me put it this way. Just like the Final Fantasy series, I'm all for Falcom innovating and trying different things to keep the series fresh and exciting. I'm just not sure if this change really did anything to accomplish that, or if it just watered the combat down more than was necessary. Skills and abilities still look flashy and are fun to use, and seeing big numbers and waves of enemies getting wiped out is always fun. I'm just not quite sure about the rest. I enjoyed it for what it was, but I'm not decided yet on whether I would like to see this sort of thing continued, and the same is true of the monoline system. As for other combat details, Ys X also takes a page out of Assassin's Creed Black Flag and allows you to have a ship where you go sailing through the Gulf, exploring islands, getting into ship battles, and even raiding and recapturing enemy islands. And starting out, your ship, the Sandras, is painfully slow, but you get the ability to upgrade it as you go and turn your ship into an unstoppable force on the ocean. The satisfaction of a fully decked out ship that can obliterate anything in its path just feels great. Unfortunately, New Game Plus resets your ship progress, which kinda sucks, but as long as you hoard materials from your playthrough, it shouldn't take long to get your upgrades knocked out as they become available again. Honestly, the ship and exploration of Abelia Gulf was very fun for me and gave me the same level of enjoyment that I had when playing Ys 8 for the first time. Is it perfect? No, but there were roadblocks to your progress in the early parts of Ys 8 as well that were annoying, but existed for story reasons. It is what it is. Still, once major areas open up, setting sail on the high seas and exploring each area of the map and opening up new areas to visit was always satisfying, and there are some side quests you can come across that help with world building once you discover these places, including an island run by Griegers who look human, or, one of my favorites, a Grieger who falls in love with a blind girl and wants to protect her without her ever knowing he exists. I won't ruin how it ends, but you owe it to yourself to go exploring, and the game highly encourages it. There's also the obligatory fish catching and needing to collect one of every fish in the game and then feeding it to something. They did something like this in Ys 8, though I don't quite remember if it was in Ys 9 as well. Honestly, these are my least favorite side quests, and it reminds me of the obnoxious side quests in games like Xenoblade Chronicles 2, where you had to give certain items to certain NPCs to fill up a progress bar just to finish a quest. I don't know why, but I always hated those sorts of quests, and I don't like them here either. Fortunately, there are only 2 of those in this game, but as long as you catch one of every fish in the game, it's simple enough to complete, if not just time-consuming. I would just say that as you find different fishing spots, check each of them to see if you can catch anything new, which will be indicated by an exclamation point on your bait, and you should be fine. While I enjoyed the exploration aspect of the game, I was let down by what appears to be a lack of variety in the environments. Now, I do want to be as fair about this as I can be. It's been a while since I've really played through the earlier games in the series, but I do seem to remember there being distinct areas within those games that you could visit that didn't tend to all look the same. There were mine shafts, volcanoes, castles, jungles, etc. I remember some more distinctly than others, but overall, I remember there being at least some diversity in locales. For whatever gripes I had with Ys 9, I think it actually did a good job of creating different environments, which was sorely needed after being cooped up in the castle area for so long. Ys 8 also had some variety as you explored the island, but it was still very much an island environment throughout for the most part, minus some dungeons here and there. In Ys 10, there isn't really any particular island I can point to that singled itself out from the others, except for maybe Haze Island, which has a spooky, ghostly feel to it, and the final zones of the game have a bit more variety. Otherwise, they all just sort of look the same. In all fairness, though, that does tend to be more realistic. I doubt if you were to sail through a gulf in the real world and visit different little islands and atolls, they would all look super different from one another. There's going to be a lot of the same flora and fauna on most of them, so from that perspective, it really isn't too bad. Though on the same concept, the soundtrack wasn't bad, but it didn't really just blow me away either. I can't think of a particular zone where the music really just impressed me. There was no Sunshine Coastline, for example, from Ys 8 that really set the tone of a new adventure. There was no Desert of Despair, which was an absolute banger from Ys 7. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, there were certain tracks that were used multiple times in different locations throughout the map. Again, even games like the Final Fantasy franchise will use different incidental music for different scenes. FF14 does this quite a bit. It's possible that this has been normal for the Ys series as well, and I've just never really paid attention to it, but I don't recall that being true of environments in particular. That's not to say the soundtrack is bad by any stretch of the imagination. It's serviceable as an Ys soundtrack, and the music is enjoyable, but it just didn't quite hit the same high marks that other games in the series set as the standard for the franchise. So, how do I feel about the game overall? Well, aside from quibbling over changes to the battle system, something the franchise does every so many games to keep things interesting, and minor complaints over environments and the soundtrack, all quite serviceable but nothing outstanding, I've had a blast with it. In fact, I'm in the process of grinding out stat elixirs to do my customary process of getting my character stats to an absurd level to absolutely destroy harder difficulties. I know, there are those that refuse to do an Inferno run on anything but a new game, but I'm not a masochist. I prefer to be so godlike that enemies crumble in my wake, and even the hardest boss gets taken down in seconds because Adol is such a beast of a protagonist as far as I'm concerned. For those who haven't yet played the series, I saw a forum post once asking who would win in a fight between Adol and Link, and one of the responses said that betting on Link to win would be like betting on Glass Joe to win against Mike Tyson in Punch-Out! To clarify, I mean Mike Tyson back in his prime, not whatever it was we saw in his boxing match against Jake Paul. Kudos to him for going 8 rounds against a guy half his age, but everyone going on about how Paul can now say definitively that he beat Mike Tyson should be saying Paul can claim that with an asterisk next to it. That's because Jake didn't beat Iron Mike Tyson, he beat Cast Iron Mike. It sounds good until you start looking at the details, then it's not quite as impressive. True, it's not quite as bad as saying you beat Muhammad Ali when he was in the throes of Parkinson's disease, but let's not pretend it was an even match in the slightest. That said, all things equal, Adol would curb stomp Link into the ground. Of course, then you have to decide which version of Link he fought, and then it starts to get needlessly complicated. The point is, Adol is the GOAT, and I want to see it in the most extreme form possible when I play through on harder modes. All things considered, I had about as much fun playing this game as I did Ys 8, and that means I probably had more fun playing this game than most other games I've played in a long time, and that's saying something because there have been some games I've played in recent years that I've truly loved, but there's something about a really solid Ys game that just hits all the right buttons. So, if you're looking for something to play that's just a fun story with some fast-paced combat and fun exploration, then I cannot recommend checking out Ys 10 enough, let alone recommending the entire franchise. Ys is an unsung hero of hack-and-slash RPGs over here in the West, and that's just a shame, because it really deserves more attention than it gets. Anyway, that's it for me. I'll be coming out with a farming guide soon for stat elixirs, which has taken me several hours to run numbers and test various methods, but I'll be getting that out soon, as well as continuing my Silent Hill 2 comparison series. With all that going on, as well as some IT internship work I'm having to do after hours, it may be a little while before I do another full game review anytime soon, but I'll probably have some other stuff getting uploaded as well, even if it isn't game related. So, until then, you all take care, and I'll talk to you later.